Thank you all for joining us at the BLMLA Town Hall sessions. This is where we get to critically engage in, I think, the kind of political education that we can't get at a protest. Right now is the time that we need it. And there's been something that's been weighing heavily on myself. And I'm lucky enough to be in relationship to Pat and Sandy, who are joining us today. I'll let y'all introduce yourselves in a moment, but I am Janaea Future Khan. I'm the International Ambassador for Black Lives Matter. And this subject matter that we're dealing with today is going to be on gender-based violence in our movements and around them. And when you hear gender-based violence, I really want you to know that we're going to be talking about issues related to trans, non-binary communities, and women and girls. And from henceforth, when we use the term women and girls, know that that is an inclusive term because there are ways in which our people, the people who are working hardest for us, which is our trans women, our Black women out there on the streets, when it comes time for us to be there for them, we fail. And we fail as people, we fail as movements, and we fail as a society. And so that is the subject matter that we'll be dealing with and what we need to do to change that. I'm going to pass it over to Sandy to introduce herself, and then we can head on over to Pat.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Sandy. I'm from Toronto. I am the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto and Black Lives Matter Canada. And I'm currently located in Los Angeles. I'm going to school out here. So that's partly why I'm joining you today. And the type of movement work that I'm involved in, the type of movement work, principles that center everything that I do really has me thinking that our movements are not worth it if they're not led by people who are the most targeted for devaluation in our society, and that is trans folk, trans feminine folk, women, Black women, and so that is the center of our organizing in Toronto and in Canada as a movement.
Thanks so much for the intro, Sandy, and for your words. Pat, I'm going to hand it over to you just to introduce yourself, and then we can start getting into it.
All right, I'll keep mine short. Pat Patricio Manuel. I think most people, if people know of me, they know me as the first professional male boxer who is transgender. But that is not my main thing in life. What I primarily do is actually physical-based practices invested in using them as a tool for healing trauma. That's really what I do and how I think I come into these movement spaces. I'm not affiliated with any specific organization, but more the communities that I feel accountable to, and also the relationships I've developed, which have been across many different arenas that have also informed just my analysis, as well as impacted by my own experiences as a mixed race Black man who is transgender. And I'm based out of Los Angeles. I'm up in the northern part of LA. I'm northeast in Duarte, where I box out of.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, which will be most of you, these two folks, for very different reasons, and for some of the same, are very near and dear to my heart. And this is a trusted conversation and a difficult one. I want to tell you that at the last protest I attended, which was yesterday, which was, Jackie Lacey Must Go, I found myself at a loss for words, because there's a way that when we say justice for George Floyd, for example, I know what that means. I know what it means to say justice for George Floyd, because I understand what movement it's anchored in. We understand that part of that is in defunding the police and holding killer cops accountable, getting DAs out, DAs like Jackie Lacey. And then something like what happened to Toyin Salau comes up, a young Black woman, 19 years old, hardly a woman, didn't even get the chance at Black Lives Matter protest, out there on the mic, screaming for us, fighting for us. And she was, and for those at home, just know that we're going to be talking about some difficult things here, and to just brace yourself and stay grounded. But she was murdered, and she was murdered having done so much work, and she was murdered by someone who is from our community, by a Black man. And I want to be really clear in this conversation that as we're grappling with this, it's going to be challenging. But when we say, for example, justice for Toyin, or when we say justice for, Dominique or Ria, which were two Black women, Black trans women who were also killed, it's not just about police. And that is a very hard and difficult thing to grapple with. We are not just talking about police. And even when we talk about a Breonna Taylor, for example, where it seems like the circumstances that stole George Floyd from us would be consistent with a Breonna Taylor sleeping in her bed. That should have gotten as many people out on the streets. It should have as many shares. I checked Instagram with George Floyd. I think last time I checked, the hashtag had been used around 2.9 million times. With Breonna Taylor, it was around 300,000. And so there is something in us as a society where we are not showing up for Black women and girls, even when the circumstances are consistent with that of Black men. And I want to be very clear about something. We know that there is, we don't need to make up a conspiracy. We know that much of the world is against Black men. It's why we are on the streets for Black men. And what we're seeing is that that support is not reciprocated, and that's not singular to Black men. That's all of us. I see there are less people on the streets all the time, if you can get any out. And so even though we know that in order for a Black man to be selected as one of the few who actually get upheld and fought for, because honestly, there are so many Black men who are murdered by police, the circumstances for people to care and get out for them have to be so specific. Where, for example, we fight for a George Floyd, but not a Sean Reed. But when it comes to Black women and girls, we don't see people out on the streets who are not Black women and girls. For trans people, when we, with Tony McDade, a Black trans man, we also didn't see people on the street. It's been women and trans people and non-binary people who fight for Breonna, Toyin, Tony, Ria, and Dominique. And I started to realize that when we as a society say justice for Toyin, for example, it's not rooted in the same kinds of understanding as when we say justice for George Floyd, because the truth is, we would have to admit, in order to say that Black women deserve protection, which I see sometimes by Black women and girls, I'm not seeing that echoed back, because in order, I believe, for society to say that this is true, it would mean we would have to acknowledge that it is us that Black women and girls need to be protected from. And that is a very difficult thing. And I just, I suppose my question to you both, just, and please hop in where it makes sense to, and because this is a very vague question. I know I just said a lot, but I want to ask you, Pat, I'll start with, and then, we can hop over to Sandy, but I wanted to ask you, why do we not see people on the street for Breonna Taylor? What do we do when there's not even a language for someone like Tony McDade? What is it? Why are these things happening? And what is it that we need to do to change it? Or maybe we can get to that last part later on, but why is it so hard for us to show up?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the $1 million question, right? It's like, why do certain people get prioritized as being uplifted as someone we should fight for? And as you said, even among cisgender straight men, like, who even then has the image that gets put on this pedestal as like, this is the person we need to fight for, when what we're really fighting for isn't about individuals, but we're fighting for all our collective liberation. And what I'm seeing over and over and over again is this concept of collective, and this concept of community is more about majority. And by majority, I don't mean the number games, even though we do know Black cisgender straight men do get murdered by police at high rates. There's still violence happening to all Black people in this country, but I mean majority as in who has the power. And I think this is where other systems of oppression come into play, and we're seeing patriarchy really rear its head. And we're often told we are being divisive if we are asking for an inclusion of everyone else, which I find really baffling, because if we're literally asking that you care about everyone, how are we dividing the community? And I think we really need to look at it and be like, are we fighting to have one supremacy swap for the other, or are we looking actually for liberation?
Yes. Sandy, feel free to hop in around your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, you asked so many complicated questions in that little bit of time, and there's so much to unpack there. One of the things is like the big question of why. It's like it just comes down to who we value in society, who we value and who we do not value. I mean, that's the whole reason for all of this. That's the whole reason why we come together to organize. But I do think that there is a way that Black women are so devalued, that Black trans people are so devalued in our society, that even when we're saying, look, power structure, these people have value, even when people are willing to come together and coalesce around that idea, there is still a power structure embedded in even that idea of who we uplift and say, hey, these people have value, have inherent value, their lives have inherent value. And, you know, I've been organizing over the last few weeks in Toronto, even while I'm out here, and a lot of my engagement has been through the media, being present for interviews to help people unpack the idea of defunding the police and what's happened. And also because the day after George Floyd was murdered, there was a woman in Toronto, a Black and Indigenous woman named Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who there was some sort of struggle in her apartment. Her family called for mental health support. The police arrived, and there was a struggle between her and the police, and they killed her. She fell off of her balcony, 26 stories, and was left outside for 6 hours. Okay, that week, the media contacted me several times to talk about the rallies that were taking place across Canada, the rallies that were taking place across America. Every time they asked me, will you come and speak about George Floyd? One of those times, each of those times I would say, I will come and speak about George Floyd, and I will also come and speak about Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and I will also speak about, and about, and about. And one of those times, the reporter who asked me, you know, will you come and speak about George Floyd? I said, I want to make sure that you know that I will also be coming to speak about Regis Korchinski-Paquette. She responded to me to say, well, we really want to focus on American racism, which is a whole other thing in itself. And so we will not have time to speak about Regis Korchinski-Paquette or Breonna Taylor. Now, Breonna Taylor is American. I didn't bring up Breonna Taylor, and whether or not I could have when I was on the air is a whole other question. But she didn't just see the question that I said to her as, hey, there's a local issue here. She saw it as both there's a local issue and there's a gendered issue that I don't want to get into. She said, I don't want to talk about Breonna Taylor. And that means that right there, that person also had an inherent value system attached to the people who she thought was worth discussing. And that's pretty friggin' disgusting, okay? I mean, the amount of people who I've raised Tony McDade with in the last couple of weeks who hadn't even heard about it, who are journalists. These are people who are supposed to do their research before they get on the air to tell us what's going on. The other thing that you raised, Janae, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more future, is that, you know, it's not just the police who are killing Black women. It's not just the police who are killing Black trans people. That violence, a lot of that violence is also coming from Black men, and we have to talk about that. We have to be honest with it if we're going to actually address that issue.
Yes. And it is such a hard thing. You know, it is such a hard thing. I am someone who was socialized as a woman, like grew, that was, my orientation in the world is very much that of a Black woman, no matter how, genderqueer or non-binary I am now. And there is such a code built into how we talk about what happens to us, the way that when I came of age, I felt like a lot of the men in my neighborhood, in my community, were just wolves at the gate. It didn't matter how straight up and down I was. And I think too, like, and let's just dispel any myths for those of you out there that, think that there's some sort of, nobody loves Black men more than Black women and girls. Like that is, let's just dispel any kind of myth as that is who we are out on the street for. We love our folks. Black people show up and love Black people hard, because our love has to be bigger than the hate in the world for us. And so this isn't a matter of some sort of conspiracy or some sort of agenda that Black men have. I truly believe it is about access. I believe that every single population, every person is trained to hate Black women and girls. I know, because I learned to hate myself. I learned that the world hated me, and I had to fight and claw my way back. And it was a very difficult thing. I want to bring that up because, it really truly to me is about access. I mean, we see how Black women and girls are treated out in the world. We see how trans femme people are treated out in the world. And these things are exacerbated by Blackness in unimaginable kinds of ways. And so what I want to be clear about, if you're wondering what I'm trying to say, I want to be clear about the fact that given the chance, how Black men treat Black women is how everyone does. And it really is just about access. So I want to be really clear about that. And there's, I guess, this is a hard conversation to me. It feels, even now I can feel my mechanism sort of wanting to clamp down on the language that I use and self-center to try to make the issue smaller than it is. And again, Sandy and Pat, you both raised Tony McDade and our language around that. And Pat, you were really also talking about our movement cultures. I wonder what is the role of education? I'll build on that in a moment. If we're going to capitalize on a cultural moment right now, for anyone who's been paying attention online, there's been back and forth between J. Cole and No Name. No Name is a Black woman rapper, and has been doing this political education work for a good chunk of time. That includes a book club, sends book to prisons and everything else. And J. Cole puts out this verse that is all about No Name, and essentially says, you say really true and dope things, but the way that you say it is divisive, and you say it too aggressively, and it's not our fault that we don't know things, and what are you doing to educate people instead of just complaining? And he just sort of completely erased any of her work, any of her scholarship, and her commitment to this movement time. And then in response to some of the backlash said, I stand by every word that I said. And No Name just sort of responded to that recently, in the last couple hours actually, and essentially said, that there's this demon on my shoulder and says, it's patriarchy. And so there's this sort of narrative that anytime, and Pat, you spoke to this, and I'm wondering if we could get a little deeper, you spoke to this, but to raise issues around misogynoir or misogyny. Misogynoir is the culmination of anti-Black racism and misogyny. But just with the realities of misogynoir, and just the lack of language, or the fact that anytime these other issues are brought up, we're being called divisive. And so then we say, well, okay, we need to educate our folks. And then you see this kind of response like J. Cole. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on why this is used. Why is it that when we talk about our issues and we say that this too is Black liberation, that we too are Black liberation, that is who we are, that is what we represent. Why is there such a concerted effort to shut that conversation down instead of build it up? Why do you think that is?
I mean, I feel like I keep saying like, good question, because like if we could find the answers to this, I feel like we'd be a lot further on in this whole movement in general. I think, you know, as we discussed, you were saying, Peter, about like your upbringing and your learning and how much it's impacted yourself and your identity today. Just even thinking about myself, even though like I live my life now seen as a Black man, I'm in community with Black people across genders. I essentially was raised to be a white woman. You know, I was raised by white parents as a female sign of birth child. And just how much work that takes to undo all the internalized anti-Blackness and also undo all the internalized femphobia I felt because I was so trying to push back against what I was being force-fed over and over and over. And I'm still in a process of doing that. I'm almost 35 years old, and I'm someone who has sat with a lot of people, been called in, called out all the time. And I think I am where I am today because of my commitment to being accountable for when I've caused harm. And I think as a broader community, understanding like we all have a lot of work to do, and what does accountability look like? Not in a disposability, but what does it look like of actually saying, that wasn't my intent, or I didn't know, but I understand that I harmed you and I'm sorry and I'm committed to doing better. And I think we need to be having these broader discussions because it's not just about education. You can't force education on someone who doesn't think they did anything wrong or doesn't think they need to know anything. Like people really need to look at themselves, including the people who have caused harm, and be like, oh, okay, I hear you, even if I don't fully understand what the impact of my words are, because I believe in Black lives mattering, every single life mattering, then I'm really going to sit with this and figure out like, what was my impact? How can I be accountable? How can specifically my actions demonstrate that I am trying to learn? Because we have so many people, we see this in racism all the time. Sorry, my dog is running over to here. We see this with like white allies, for example, who will be like, well, I'm trying my best. Like J. Cole essentially did the same shit to No Name and was like, oh, well, you didn't say it right. It's not on the person who has been harmed to address it properly to someone. It is the person who caused harm, if they are really about transformation, to be like, let me sit with this a little bit. Let me think on this a little bit, and let me demonstrate how I can do better. And I think we need to figure out better ways to do this. And it's really difficult when we've all been raised in the system that is only looking to punish us when we do something wrong, whether that's wrong or not. So many of us are afraid to admit like, hey, I fucked up. Hey, I did something wrong, because we're so used to dealing with such ramifications for it.
Yeah, I think that there's a way that power dynamics impact exactly what Pat's saying here, like how people are able to really reflect on how their own participation could possibly be wrong, bad, incorrect, harmful. I can't imagine J. Cole doing what he did to No Name, to someone who, like a cis man rapper. I can't imagine him doing it. I have a feeling he'd pick up the phone and be like, I don't understand this, or whatever it is, before trying to drag someone or slap them down publicly. And that has something to do with the power dynamic. And that, I think, another difficult conversation that we have to have as organizers is that can exist in our movement, right? And we have to be willing to be told, you done fucked up, you done did this wrong, and you have some things to learn. And I mean, Future's laughing right now, and probably because we started Beyond Toronto together, right? And we literally have been through this. We have been through this. Like I have to admit to myself that there was there was a person in our group for a long time that was transphobic and harmful to trans people, even while we were saying to other people, you know, like, we're centering trans folks and we center trans feminist orientation. And we let that happen. And we did not stop it when we should have. We did not stop it when we could have. You know, we talked about it after, you know, like, that person is no longer organizing with us. We tried to, you know, go through the difficult work that one needs to go through of, like, transformation. And the completion of that for us in that particular instance was that that one particular person decided to no longer, you know, organize with us. But there was a transformation that had to happen for me too. And for everybody else who was around, saw that shit happening and didn't say nothing the whole time. You know, that is participation in transphobic behavior. And we have to be able to take a look at ourselves and say, hey, I'm a part of it, in the same way that we have to look at it with gender, in the same way that we have to look at it with respect to, like, light skin privilege in our movements and so on, all of this stuff, right? And, you know, if you have power, you need to be able to just, you know, I have, like, Toronto slang in my head. I was about to say, you need to just fucking knife that shit and just go in there. I don't know, other people use knives? Like, just get rid of it. Take it out. Make it done, okay? And, like, make sure that you're, like, listening to the people who are undervalued in society and potentially undervalued in your group. And you're not recognizing that. And that takes a lot of discomfort. It's going to maybe take a long time. It's not something that gets done in one conversation. It's a process. But that's the kind of thing that we need to do in our movements if we're going to be really real about having these conversations out in the world.
And if I could hop in real quick on that, just to kind of build on that in future, I discussed this a little bit with you last night. You know, there are relationships that I'm accountable to who were harmed by BLM-LA leadership and other BLM chapters, specifically around Black trans women and Black trans femme, who felt, especially early on, that when they voiced their concerns of their community, their own identities being murdered, both by the police and by people in the Black community, that they were told to wait, that they were told to silence. And what has waiting done? Like, we're watching the numbers continue to increase. We're watching the violence. And this also includes Black trans masculine people who often go to prison too and get murdered, who often don't even get acknowledged in these moments. And what does it look like as an organization or network, or these organizations and network, who are calling for not only the police to be accountable for creating a better system, actually abolishing it because police don't fit into the system that sees people as human and allows them an opportunity to transform, but this whole state as it is of, like, how do we create something different? How do we model that within our own organizations? If that is what we stand behind, how are we making sure that the most vulnerable of us are also being put front to the center, and that they're not being pushed aside and told to wait over and over, even as their blood gathers in the streets?
Ooh, yes. You know, look, you know, Pat and Sandy and everybody who's listening at home now and later on, there's no such thing as a perfect movement. And I think that is such a hard thing to know. We live in an imperfect, actually a monstrous society. And to help illustrate Sandy's point, because, you know, I was there and I was one of the people who was experiencing this, this transphobia. The person who was saying that the person was cloaking her transphobia in social justice rhetoric, and that made it very difficult to deal with. It was very much, you are misogynist. And anytime we said, hey, can you think about these other ways of looking at the world as, you know, two people who identify along the trans spectrum, there are some considerations we need to make around these identities. And the response was, you are trying to silence a Black woman, you are misogynist. And so there's a way in which we will even use our language of liberation as bludgeons against each other, you know, and Pat, you know, you're saying, well, we got to wait. And here's the thing, there's never going to be a time where we're suddenly going to be equipped to deal with gender-based violence in our movements. We just have to do it in the same way that we have been told to wait again and again and again as Black people, that things will just naturally change. Not a single concession has been made by this country, by North America, and by the West that hasn't been fought for, that we have not shed blood for, that we have fought every aspect of societal apparatus that you could think of law enforcement and of the judicial system in order to get even the barest amount of recognition and to try to carve out some sort of sense of safety with each other. And so it really is understanding that we too have these hierarchies built within us, and that we too can become dangerous and level them against each other without even recognizing it. And, I wonder, I saw this awful tweet by this man who said, if we're so horrible, then stop going out on the streets for us. And I just thought to myself, what a sad and disappointing and unfortunate response. Because the thing is, when it comes right down to it, in this movement here, a movement that has been led by queer and trans people, by women and girls, and everything has an asterisk with it, because again, our use of the term women and girls and femmes, these are, and as Pat says, I think, because it's hard to reconcile masculinity, but to remember that masculinity is not inherently oppressive. Misogyny and patriarchy are, and there has to be a way that that we have narratives around trans masculinity so that we can actually talk about what happened to Tony McDade and push back against these ideas of misogyny, anti-Black racism, and the perfect victim narrative that we grapple with. And in this movement here, whose leadership has really, I think, captivated and informed, created a blueprint for movements in the digital age. We were called leaderless because we didn't have one singular male voice, and we were treated like absolute pariahs for the last 7 or 8 years. And just recently people realized the magic that we are, but the truth is that this has been happening for a lot longer than anyone thinks. And so I just raised a lot there. I raised some stuff around language, around perfect victim narratives, around the fact that our movements are inherently flawed and that there is never going to be a perfect time. I don't want to just throw too much on you, Pat, or on Sandy, but there is a question that I have for you, but I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts or reflections, based off of the things that we've all shared together, because I know I just brought out a lot in there, and I just wanted to, hear if any of those thoughts resonated or echoed back before we sort of moved into the whole what needs to happen now and what can we do next conversation. If there's any more political landscaping that we need to do around some of those ideas and concepts.
I was going to be polite and let you go first, Sandy. Unless, okay, you're on mute. There, I'll mute myself. I'll go after you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no problem. That was a lot. When you talk about there never being a perfect time, one of the things that started percolating in my mind was that we have to be really careful not to replicate the tactics that the white supremacist power structure uses against us to ignore when we're saying, stop the oppression. We can't be replicating those things. And I think it's very comfortable for us to avoid discomfort. The white supremacist power structure requires us to avoid conflict and to avoid situations of discomfort. And I actually think that for people who know me really well have heard me say this many, many times. I think that conflict is an extremely valuable thing. I think that anger is an extremely valuable emotion. I think that both of those things teach us so much if we are in tune with them. You know, if I have a conflict, I should be willing to work through it because it is worth it to me. Janaea matters to me enough for me to want to work through whatever conflict I have with them. You know, Pat matters to me enough to want to work through whatever conflict I have. And if you're going to tell me, you know, Sandy, your thought process here is just not on, or we have to address these things that may hurt you, that may sound bad to you, but there's something here to address. I don't want to reflect the white supremacist power structure by saying, you know what, if I'm not good enough then, actually, like, okay, like y'all organize, I'll just be over here. If you guys don't like me like that, then just go work on your own. Like, that's just not acceptable. I think that if we're actually coming to this place where what we are intending to build is a new world in which we are all inherently valued, in which Black lives do matter, I have an obligation and a responsibility to sit through that and to say, okay, all right, you're pissed. I might be pissed by some of the things that you say, but I'm going to sit here. Like, I have a commitment to this enough to sit here and work through this until the end. And maybe in the end, we will disagree. I mean, right now we're talking about inherent value of people, so hopefully there's no disagreement, okay? Like, generally, in a general conflict, we might come to the end and disagree, but we need to move through that. When it comes to identity and inherent value of people, there's no disagreeing at the end. You just need to understand what the fuck you did wrong and what the fuck you're not understanding. And if you don't understand it, you need to struggle through it. You need to struggle through what you don't understand. Because here's the thing that we all know as oppressed people, right? Black people, experts on white people. Alive? Women and trans people, experts on men. Alive? Right? Trans folks, experts on cis folks. That's just how it is. The oppression that you experience in society gives you a kind of knowledge that the people in power just cannot see. They just cannot see. Poor folks, experts on rich folks. Like, that's just how it works. And so we have to understand that, refuse what white supremacy tells us, which is that, you know, and refuse what capitalism tells us, which is like, you know, people who are rich because they deserve to be rich and they know something more than you. No, I'll tell you that poor people know how to stretch a dollar far more than a rich person does, okay? Same shit, men more inherently valuable than women or trans folks. No, we know that's not true. We struggle through that. That's what our movements are about. And so we have to reject those things. We have to reject feeling comfortable by ignoring discomfort.
Ooh, so many things that Sandy added now on top of it. So I'm going to try to organize all my various thoughts together. I mean, first off, revolution isn't fucking comfortable. Like, straight up, it's violent. Like, not only talking about physical violence, but spiritual, emotional, mental violence, like in terms of what we have to destroy within ourselves in order to create this world that we all dream of, where it's supposed to be like, it's not just about my dream or either of your two dreams. Like, what is this collective dream of, like, this myth? I mean, it's a trip that equality is actually a myth. It's like chasing perfectionism, right? Like, it's not actually there because we're so far from it. So just even this ideal that we're trying to birth has never happened before, and that we think that it's going to be convenient or easy and isn't going to involve personal growth that is beyond our own experience and our own trauma, is just kind of a trip to me. I'm like, where are you aiming for? Like, I feel like some people are aiming so fucking low. Like, I'm shooting for the skies. Like, I know whatever I'm leaving when I transition to the next world, like, I'm planting seeds for other people to pick up. Like, I'm not even looking for this lifetime, because what we want is so big that it cannot happen now, because we have to fight so many more battles to get there. And just, you know, Future were saying about, you know, BLM and like the way this is now being finally recognized in leadership. And I think also to point out, like, there isn't a monolithic leadership. There isn't a monolithic movement. Like, BLM, as an organization or network or whatever it's being classified as in this moment, is not only the movement, in the same way that people looked at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as the only two movements and completely erased massive grassroots organizers and just Black autonomous leadership out there. Like, we are not one monolithic being out there, and that's uncomfortable for people. That's why binaries exist. That's why white and Black exist as a structure. That's why man and woman exist as a structure, but that is not what is being human, and that is not life. You just have to look a little bit into the natural world to find out things get complicated really quickly. But it's actually that diversity that makes it so much more interesting and what brings so much to the table. I mean, look at the three of us. We all have very different experiences. We even look different, like everything about that. And that is what's so beautiful and what is really powerful of our movement and what whiteness is afraid of. They created these structures that are very rigid because they want control. Once they realize that this doesn't work, we're all spilling out, how are they supposed to contain that? And I think a lot of the work that we need to do as people is to really deconstruct what we have learned from white supremacy. Like, I know you look back into West African practices before colonization, trans people existed. Gender did not exist in the same way. And so when I see so often just really hurtful comments of Black folks saying LGBTQ people have their own movement, as if we're not a part of this, as if we're not Blackness. And I've had some really interesting conversations with my friend, Dr. Treva Ellison, who was telling me about Dr. Deborah Miranda's work and how specifically the Spanish, when they were conquering indigenous folks in the Americas, made sure to annihilate first the gender nonconforming people, because those people were connected to the birth and life cycles of the tribe. We see that there was clearly an invested interest in destroying gender nonconformity within African people who were stolen. Why do you think that is? Do white people just destroy stuff ad hocly? Like, usually there's a reason behind why they spent so much time not only murdering us, but also planting seeds for the rest of our community to turn and say, that person's wrong. Let me make sure that person doesn't sit with me. That person's something else. Like, I don't understand how so many people understand that whiteness has fed us lies and then continue to regurgitate the same lies over and over into harming people within our community.
Oh, we did not come to play today. We did not come to play. Yes, there was so much there. And I want to highlight 2 points, one by Sandy and one by Pat. One is the idea of people being experts on other people. It is because our survival is incumbent on it. And so I am an expert on whiteness. I'm an expert on masculinity because I needed to become an expert on whiteness because I've studied it. I've studied it. You have to study in order to survive. Trans people are experts on cis cultures, that's non-trans communities, and it's not just that we just study it, it's that it is thrust upon us whether we want it to be or not. It is in our education, it is in our media, it is in our representation, it is in the stories that we are told as children, and the same can be true, the same is true of masculinity, and the same, I mean, that is how power works. It makes it so that we are constantly looking upwards towards what is at the height of that status quo, that power structure. And rarely does that small mythical norm ever stop to look down, so I wanted to highlight that because, that is something that we discuss a lot. It's my great pleasure, but I'm sure, I don't know if everyone else would love to go down the rabbit holes that Sandy and I end up going through for hours at a time when we just said hello. And it was my intention sometimes is just to say good night, and then it's 3 hours later and I'm exhausted, but my mind is full. And the other part that I wanted to uplift around Pat was in referring, and this is the thing, our societies are organized around binary. So Sandy really helped to break down the levels of the hierarchy. And what Pat did was explain to us how that hierarchy is, or that Sandy brought the vertical, Pat brought the horizontal, which is also to say these binary systems that we live in, which is Black and white, good and evil, straight and queer, or whatever, cis and trans, and that when we look at it in this really rigid, impossible system, and I want to say a violent system, a system that not all of us were meant to fit in. In fact, I would argue most of us weren't. It's just that some of us would really forfeit a big part of who we are for creature comforts and comforts of the body. And the idea of this binary, and we break it down even further around black and white, and how that informs our sense of morality. Because in whiteness you have innocence, and in blackness you have guilt sort of built into it. It's why we always have the question in the back of our minds around black people being murdered by police or gun-wielding vigilantes. But what did they do first? As in, there must have been something that person did to deserve it. And all of us know that is an awful and wrong thing. Enough at least in the chosen black men, because not all black men are uplifted in this, but the chosen black men that American and North American society and the West decides to galvanize behind. We will take to the streets. But when it comes to women, black trans people, black trans women, black femmes, and trans femmes, it's almost like there isn't even the question of whether or not she deserved it. It is the assumption that she did. With Toyin, I saw, well, what was she doing out late at night? Why wasn't she at home? And none of these questions were put on the men who harmed her. And to that, and this idea of, well, we just didn't know. Well, how could we have known that was a bad, the wrong question to ask? And we saw the tension around education with J. Cole. None of us start out knowing. You have to actually try. You have to try. You have to want to know. And that is what Pat has said and what Sandy has said. And, with all of this, in this landscaping of these binaries and of these hierarchies that Sandy and Pat have illustrated, I wanted to ask you all, because we know it's deeper than education, right? There's an ignorance we can deal with. Willful ignorance is a choice. And I wanted to ask you, because listen, what we've all alluded to tonight is when we come together, no matter what, betrayal is going to happen, because we live in a colonial project where we've all been educated about who each and every one of us is. We come in with presupposed and preconceived notions of everyone and everything. And so we need to, I think, have a stomach for the fact that some betrayal is going to happen, that some things are going to be said that are harmful, and that there has to be a way in which that harm that's caused, there's care and there's accountability, and also there has to be boundaries around what kinds of harm is acceptable and what kinds of harm is not. And so I wanted to ask you both about that and about bottom lines. What are some, and if you give me a little wink or a nod if you need a little time to think about it so I know who to go to first, it's probably going to be Sandy because of that lipstick. It's perfect. It's perfect. I want to ask you, what are some bottom lines that we need across the political left, that we need in our movements? And as Pat said, our vast movements, our grassroots movements that people just did not know how to stretch their minds around. What are some bottom lines that we need right now to change our moral apathy when it comes to gender-based violence, when it comes to showing up for Black women and girls and our trans and non-binary folks? What are some things that can shift and that need to shift, or that bottom lines that we need to incorporate on a cultural level right now? Mute.
I don't know if I understand what you mean by bottom line. So if you could just give me one example and then I'll riff.
Okay, yes, for sure. Okay, very quickly, when the Nation of Islam was my security detail, this is a group that is historically homophobic and transphobic, and yet they were there to be my security because there were lynch ropes hung up on the trees at the place where I was going to give my talk. And so they decided that they would be my security for the day. And all those conversations were had. Melina helped set it up. She has relationships to the Nation of Islam. And so that day, they didn't know what my pronoun was, or they didn't even read me as queer, which is confusing because, my gender identity at the time was very much Battlestar Galactica. But at least for that evening, they believed that my life was worth protecting, and I believed that their life was worth protecting. And so that could be a bottom line. And please don't feel fixated on the notion of bottom lines. If you just have ideas around what are some things that need to shift culturally, what are some things that we need to do that can be done right now, what are some calls to action for Black men and non-trans people, and really all men, around changes that need to occur right now.
Okay, I hear you. I think one thing that is just so important, and that is a struggle that I've seen a bunch of our chapters and other movement folks outside of BLM struggle with, is this idea, which you kind of raised when you were talking about Toyin, of the perfect victim. But are we arguing for inherent value in everyone or not? Is that real or not? People will make decisions about which people they're going to hail up, about what questions they're going to ask, about whom in a particular situation. And that's what you're really raising when you're talking about what happened to Toyin and people asking questions about what she was doing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The questions should not be leveled at her. I remember, when there was a killing in Toronto, a police killing in Toronto, and this was of someone who had been involved in gun violence and, the black market drug trade, whatever, right? And people were like, can we really raise this person up? Is this going to be difficult? And have the conversation. I'm not saying the conversation shouldn't be had, but have the conversation in a way that is inherently values this person's humanity, right? The conversation should be about, is there considerations for this person's family and the danger that the media might put on them, the danger that the media might put on people close to them, and so on, rather than having a conversation of, well, this person was involved in this, that, the other, so I'm not sure if we can raise that person, and that's why, I think for us, we have to start talking more about things like sex work. We have to start talking more about gender. We have to start talking more about internalized gender-based violence in our movement. Because, come on, it's what do we truly believe that everyone has inherent value or not? What are we fighting for? And so for me, it really has to be a bottom line that if we're saying everybody has inherent value, we're saying everybody has inherent value. And if you're not saying that, and that's not really what you mean, then I can't organize with you. I have to make the decision that I can't organize with you on this piece like that. I just can't do it. And I think that these are critical, these discussions are of critical importance, and we can't ignore them. Because if we ignore them, we're just going to replicate the power structure as it already exists. We have to actively be questioning ourselves.
I'll take that lull as my turn. I don't know if I necessarily have a bottom line, and I feel like I'm going to say something that kind of contradicts earlier things that were said, but I'm just, as I was sitting there thinking, just the term gender-based violence, and really thinking about that and thinking about our conversations just around cisgender men, straight men in particular, causing harm. And I'm just thinking about, particularly, I feel like my work, who I spend my time working with, is primarily straight men of color, because of boxing, because I have this privilege of I'm a straight trans man who's very legible. I connect very well with them to be able to push them these conversations and challenge them when they get out of pocket. And all I can think about is how many have been harmed, and this isn't to center cisgender men, but how do we acknowledge when that, as everyone, I firmly believe everyone is a trauma survivor in this society. Everyone, including the people in powers. How do we acknowledge that there are people who harm us? And guess what? They've been harmed. That is a really, really complex situation. Just thinking about, because I'm often involved in conversations around child sexual abuse, and I've had a number of cisgender straight men disclose to me that they were raped as children. And just thinking about, like, when we think of gender-based violence, I think the numbers may be skewed because we know that boys and men don't disclose. So even in this conversation, we start going into a binary because there is a power structure, because of patriarchy, that cisgender straight men are like the people we're battling against. But I'm just also like, how do we as a community be able to hold all those complexities and be like, I see that you're hurt, and a lot of the harm that you're causing is because you've been harmed. And maybe it goes into, like, for me, a bottom line is people really acknowledging that despite the personal harm that they've had, how their own privileges and the way they move through the world may be causing larger harm to other people who don't have specific power in this dynamic. And, I think it gets really, really hard. And we see this, even in prison abolition. I sat with prisoners who have raped children and women, and also people who have murdered. And every single one of them was saying, like, no one ever cared. Like, this is the only place I got healing was in prison. And, I think if we're looking to really end these cycles of abuse, really discerning where they come from. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't even know how we start with that. I don't know how we, it's not anyone's responsibility to tend to cisgender straight men who are hurting. I think it's more, we need more cisgender straight men to tend to the wounds of their own community so that they can stop harming us so much. And maybe then we can have a conversation of understanding all of us are harming. How are we actually complicit in harming each other in these cycles? Because I know even myself, like, whether it was intentional or not, I have caused harm. We all have caused harm. And I think I was able to move past the point of saying, I've been hurt, I've been harmed, I'm dealing with this, and actually be like, I've been hurt and I've hurt at the same time, when I really focused on my healing. So how do we heal in a world that continues to traumatize us day after day?
Absolutely. I know we only have a minute left, but I think a helpful intervention is to move past this notion of violent genders and move into the reality of gendered violence, because we're all gendered. We all go through the process of gendering. And so I think that there's a possibility in that language. And I think it sort of removes the sort of shield from this idea that gender-based violence is only something that women and trans people think about or experience, and really it's something that we all do. And I think so much of our framework today in society is around violent genders, and that's a very interesting and complicated and ugly thing when it comes to Black women who are masculinized, especially if they're darker skinned and seen as aggressive and all of these other things, and whose stories simultaneously become very much invisibilized. So, but the idea that we're all traumatized people, I think, is absolutely, it's just it. And we're bringing that into our movement structures, and that we have to find ways to, as Sandy said, confront these realities so that we can do the world building that we need to, which is why there's so much healing work that happens within the movement for Black Lives and within grassroots movements. I believe we have a hard stop at 8, but there's just a really quick question. How do we deal with accountability and conflict within the movement? Do you have mediators? We do if we need to, but as Sandy said, we try to be in struggle with each other. And, Pat illustrated a situation where people still feel harmed. And so it is an ongoing process, and that's just it. We're sometimes building the plane as we're flying it. And as movements, we all need to be confronting the realities of gender-based violence and creating the kinds of interventions and new ideation that's required. And there are a lot of people doing that incredible work. I know, Pat, you focus a lot on like literal physical therapy. Amita, your partner, is doing incredible work on CSA. And we just have to keep doing that work and challenging ourselves so that we can have the kind of revolution that we deserve, one that doesn't replicate a colonial project. out of respect for everyone's time, I just want to say thank you to Pat and Sandy for being in this discussion with me in this dialogue. They were real ones. They let me wrangle them in very late in the game. I want to give love to all of you who are watching us at home. And yeah, we will, if you have follow-up questions, hit us up at, BLMLA. Thank you for giving us this platform to have this discussion and to be thinkers in this. And yeah, everyone, mad love and be safe.
Same to you. Thank you so much for sharing the space with me.